Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive, where we take a look at some really interesting stuff you send our way and, try to make sense of it all.
Yeah, break it down into those key insights.
Right.
Make it something that is a little bit easier to digest.
And have some fun along the way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So today we are diving deep into Chapter 28 of Simplicity of the Spirit, Built for Greatness, Built for God, BFG Movement.
And more specifically, we're going to be looking at the restore, the renewal, and the respond sections.
Okay, now this is, the subtitle immediately caught my eye. Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching. So we've got something interesting going on here. For those who might not know, the Tao Te Ching is this ancient Chinese text, and it's all about, living in harmony with the universe, finding that balance and simplicity. And it's really fascinating to see those ideas explored through, a Christian lens.
Yeah, I think that's what's so cool about this piece. It's really taking two seemingly disparate traditions and finding this really interesting conversation between the two.
Yeah, a conversation between two worlds.
Right.
So for our listener out there today, the mission of this deep dive is to really grasp that core message of this chapter. What is this conversation between, Christian thought and Taoist wisdom trying to tell us? And we're going to be looking at those ideas around simplicity, specifically this idea of balance, and it even calls out, the masculine and the feminine aspects of balance, and how all of that, contributes to spiritual growth. And then we'll see, how those concepts maybe echo in broader spiritual ideas or even in other faith traditions. Right,
exactly. Yeah, well, for those universal threads that run through these different ways of thinking about the world.
All right, so let's jump right in, starting with restore, simplicity of the spirit. What is the central idea here?
Well, at its core, this section is all about, rediscovering a really fundamental way of being.
Yeah.
It emphasizes this idea of embracing simplicity, cultivating balance, and it specifically calls out this balance between masculine and feminine principles and developing humility.
Yeah.
And it presents these as the essential paths to connecting with what it calls the eternal spirit. And one of the things that really struck me is how the chapter seems to be using the Taoist concept of yin and yang.
Right, these complementary forces.
Exactly, to illuminate these traditionally Christian ideas of humility and service. So it's suggesting that, spiritual strength isn't necessarily about, dominance or control, but rather about this dynamic interplay between seemingly opposing forces within us.
Oh, that's so interesting. So we're talking about these big themes: simplicity, balance, humility. How does the chapter really delve into those ideas? I know it highlights some specific lines, right?
Right, yeah. So let's take the first one. Know the nature of the masculine, but hold to the feminine. And the chapter connects this directly to Christian concepts of humility and meekness.
Okay.
It even brings in Matthew 20.28, where Jesus says, he came not to be served, but to serve. So it's suggesting that while we might recognize strength or assertiveness, maybe what we would call the masculine principle, the path to true spiritual connection actually lies in embracing the nurturing, the yielding qualities, what we might associate with the feminine, mirroring Christ's servant heart.
So it's not about rejecting one or the other. It's about, this kind of prioritizing that posture of service and receptivity.
Right. It's about finding that beautiful balance between the two.
Okay, so then we have be the stream of living water. Oh, that's powerful imagery.
It is, and the chapter immediately links this to the Holy Spirit, referencing John 7.3739, where it talks about, rivers of living water flowing for those who believe in him. It speaks to this idea of constant spiritual renewal and being a source of life for others.
And it mentions returning you to a weaned child, which I thought was so interesting.
Yeah, and that really resonates with that concept of childlike faith.
Absolutely.
So the chapter ties this to Matthew 18.3, where Jesus emphasizes the importance of becoming like little children. It's about a faith that's trusting, dependent, uncomplicated by ego or worldly concerns. Think about, the simple trust a young child has. That's the kind of faith that's being pointed to.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, now the next one is a little intriguing. Know the source of light within, but hold to the dark. Now, why hold to the dark? It sounds a little paradoxical.
It does sound that way, but the chapter offers a really insightful explanation. It talks about embracing both the visible and the hidden aspects of God. And it references 2 Corinthians 4.4-6, which speaks about the gospel revealing the light of Christ.
Okay.
But holding the dark isn't about embracing evil or anything like that. It's about acknowledging the mystery inherent in God's wisdom.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there are these aspects of the divine that will always be beyond our complete understanding. It encourages a sense of awe and reverence for the unknown.
So accepting those limits of our understanding and being okay with that mysterious nature of faith. Okay, so then it moves to more outward expressions with this line, be a good example to the world. But then right after that, it says, yet hold to humility.
Right.
So how do you balance those two? How do you be a light but stay humble?
That's the key question, right? How do you make an impact without becoming prideful or self-righteous?
Yeah.
And the chapter connects this beautifully to Jesus' teaching on servant leadership, where he says the greatest must be the servant of all. It also references Luke 14:7-11 about being content with the lowest place, reinforcing this idea that true influence comes from a place of humility, not from seeking recognition or status.
So your actions should reflect your faith, but your attitude should always be rooted in that humility.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the final key line in this restore section is, tools are shaped by the master carpenter from a block of plain wood.
Ah, yes.
That's such a powerful image. What does that signify?
It is powerful. And the chapter explains this symbolizes God refining believers. It references Ecclesiastes 12 and Proverbs 30.56, highlighting the value of wisdom and the purity of God's word.
Yeah.
So, the block of plain wood represents our, fundamental, perhaps even unrefined state. And the master carpenter is clearly a reference to Christ, the one who shapes and molds us for a purpose.
Beautiful. So to kind of summarize this whole restore section, it seems to be saying that by embracing simplicity and humility and by really striving for this balance of strength and gentleness within ourselves,
Right.
that we're opening ourselves up to a deeper connection with God, and we're becoming, more effective in how we actually live out our faith in the world.
Exactly. It's about stripping away those unnecessary complexities of life and, returning to those fundamental principles of faith.
I love that. Okay, so let's move on then to renewal, the Trinitarian method, MAP. And now this introduces a really structured way to put these principles into action. So tell us more about this MAP framework.
Yeah. So the chapter presents MAP as an acronym. It stands for Mindset, Aim, and Practice. And it suggests that this is a method through which God's love shapes our mindset. Trust in the Son directs our aim, and faith in the Holy Spirit guides our practice.
Okay.
So it's a very practical follow-up to those foundational ideas in the Restore section.
So it's moving from understanding to that active implementation.
Right.
Okay, so let's start with that mindset component. And there are 8 key aspects listed here. And the first, embrace balance of masculine and feminine, directly echoes what we were just discussing in Restore. So how does the chapter expand on this as a mindset?
Well, it elaborates by suggesting we consciously cultivate both strength and compassion in how we approach life.
Okay.
It even gives this real-world example of leadership that is both firm and empathetic, referencing 1 Peter 3.7 about husbands being considerate and Luke 4.18 about Jesus' mission to help the oppressed.
Right.
So it's about, internalizing this balanced perspective.
So taking that initial principle and translating it into a way of thinking and being in the world. Okay, the next mindset is live as living water. Again, drawing on that powerful imagery of spiritual nourishment.
Right.
So what does that look like as a mindset?
So the mindset here is about cultivating an inner state of spiritual abundance so that we can naturally be a source of life and encouragement to others.
Okay.
The real world application offered is actively seeking out opportunities to offer hope and support, whether it's through our words or actions.
Right.
It references John 7.38 and Isaiah 58.11, both speaking to this idea of spiritual refreshment flowing from within.
Okay, so then we have embrace the mystery of God's plan. As a mindset, this is about cultivating a deep trust in God's wisdom, even when things are unclear, accepting that we won't always have the answers, and finding peace in that uncertainty.
Exactly. And the real world application is, choosing to walk by faith during difficult times, referencing 2 Corinthians 5.7 and Proverbs 3.5-6.
Okay, the fourth mindset is lead by example, which connects with the restore idea of being a good example to the world.
So the emphasis here is on consciously striving to live with integrity and reflecting Christ's character in all our actions. The real world application being focusing on embodying qualities like kindness and honesty in our daily lives.
Yes, and it references Matthew 5.16 and 1 Timothy 4.12.
Okay, following that is practice humility in honor.
Right.
So what's the mindset here?
The mindset here is to understand that true honor comes through humility and service, not through seeking personal accolades.
Right.
The real-world application is actively choosing to put the needs of others before our own, with references to Philippians 2.3 and James 4.7.
So putting others first.
Exactly.
The sixth mindset, allow God to shape you, draws on that master carpenter analogy we discussed.
Yes.
This is about having an attitude of openness and surrender to God's refining process, even when it involves challenges or discomfort.
Right.
Trusting that it's ultimately for our growth.
And it references Romans 8.28 and Isaiah 64.8.
Okay, then we have lead with wisdom and service.
Yes.
So what is the mindset being encouraged here? The mindset here is about approaching leadership in whatever form it takes in our lives. With a primary focus on serving others and using wisdom for their benefit.
Okay.
Aiming to elevate them rather than seeking to dominate.
Right.
The real-world application is actively practicing servant leadership.
Makes sense.
Referencing Mark 9.35 and Matthew 20.26-28.
And the final mindset is remain simple and focused on God, which directly echoes that core theme of the entire chapter.
Absolutely.
This is about consciously avoiding distractions and prioritizing our relationship with God as the center of our lives.
Exactly.
So some real-world applications there would be, making time for prayer, studying scripture.
Yes.
And it references Matthew 6.33 and Luke 10.41-42.
Yeah, so you can see how this mindset section really takes those foundational principles and starts to translate them into a way of thinking and being.
Yeah, it's becoming more tangible now. So how does the chapter then move from this, internal shift to outward action in the aim section?
So the aim section essentially takes each of those mindset points and reframes them as conscious intentions or goals.
Okay.
So for balanced masculine and feminine, the aim is to actively strive to embody both strength and compassion in our interactions.
Right.
And for live as living water, the aim is to intentionally be a continuous source of spiritual refreshment for those around us.
Okay, so it's about taking that internal state and then directing it towards a specific purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that for each aim, the chapter often provides a deeper explanation, really getting into the why behind the intention, and sometimes even offering slightly different angles on the real-world applications.
Right.
For instance, when embrace the mystery of God's plan becomes an aim, it emphasizes that countercultural aspect of trusting God in a world that often demands immediate answers and certainty.
Right.
It's like saying, it's okay to not have all the answers.
Exactly. And that pattern continues, lead by example. As an aim focuses on intentionally reflecting Christ's character in our daily conduct. Practice humility and honor as an aim is about consciously choosing to lead with humility and prioritizing the service of others even when we're in positions of influence. Allow God to shape you. As an aim becomes about intentionally being open and receptive to God's refining work in our lives.
Right.
Lead with wisdom and service. As an aim emphasizes intentionally using our abilities and positions to serve and uplift others.
Yes.
And remain simple and focused on God as an aim is about intentionally keeping our lives uncluttered and centered on God's purposes.
Exactly. So aim really bridges the gap between the internal transformation of mindset and the outward expression of practice. It's about setting our spiritual compass, directing our intentions.
Okay, so now how does that practice section translate these intentions into those concrete actions?
So practice is where these principles really become tangible. It takes each of those aims and provides specific actionable steps we can take in our daily lives. So for balanced masculine and feminine, the practice is to actively cultivate that balance in all our actions, with examples like leading with both firmness and empathy in professional settings.
Okay.
Or demonstrating both strength and gentle understanding within our families.
So this is where the theoretical becomes practical.
Right. It's not just about what we think or intend, but what we actually do.
Absolutely. So for live as living water, what are some of those practical steps?
Well, the practice involves intentionally seeking out opportunities to encourage others, actively listening to their struggles, offering prayer and support, sharing guidance rooted in our faith.
Right. And for embrace the mystery of God's plan.
The practice is to consciously choose to trust in God's timing and direction when we face uncertainty or challenges, rather than giving in to anxiety or trying to control everything.
Okay, so it's about letting go.
Exactly.
And for lead by example.
The practice is to consistently demonstrate Christ-like behavior in all areas of our lives, in our work, our relationships, our communities.
Got it. So for practice humility and honor, what does that look like in practice?
The practice involves, actively embracing humility, even when we are recognized or in positions of authority.
Okay.
And to find fulfillment in serving others without expecting praise or reward.
So it's about that genuine desire to serve.
Exactly. For allow God to shape you, the practice is to intentionally surrender to God's refining process, viewing difficulties not as setbacks, but as opportunities for spiritual growth and transformation.
Okay, so seeing those challenges as opportunities.
Exactly. And then for lead with wisdom and service, it becomes about actively using any leadership roles we have to serve and uplift others, prioritizing their needs and well-being.
Makes sense. And lastly, for remain simple and focused on God.
The practice involves actively maintaining that focus by prioritizing our relationship with God through regular prayer Bible study and, simplifying our lives to minimize distractions that pull us away from that central focus.
So it's about that intentional effort to keep things uncluttered. So the MAP framework really provides this clear and actionable path. First, cultivate the right way of thinking. Second, set your intentions in alignment with that thinking. And third, consistently put those intentions into practice through those concrete actions in your daily life.
Exactly. It's a holistic approach to spiritual renewal grounded in those foundational principles from the Restore section.
Okay, that gives us a really comprehensive understanding of that renewal aspect.
Yep.
Now let's move on to the final section, Respond, Embracing Shared Truths. And this sounds like it's taking that personal renewal we've been discussing and extending it outwards towards a broader understanding of spirituality.
That's exactly it. This section introduces this idea that this inner transformation empowers a response that goes beyond personal holiness and discipleship.
Okay.
It actively encourages interfaith dialogue by focusing on those shared truths that exist across different spiritual traditions. And for each of the first 5 mindset and practice principles we discussed, balance, living water, mystery, example, and humility, the chapter actually explores parallel teachings from a variety of faiths: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism.
Wow, that's incredibly broad. So let's take the first principle, balance masculine and feminine. What kinds of parallels does the chapter draw there?
Okay, so within Christianity, it points to the balanced expression of justice and mercy in God's character and Jesus' actions.
Okay.
In Islam, it highlights the attributes of Allah that encompass both power and compassion.
Got it.
Hinduism presents the divine in both masculine and feminine forms like Shiva and Shakti, representing dynamic energy and creative power. Buddhism speaks to the importance of that balance between wisdom and compassion on the path to enlightenment.
Okay.
And Judaism references the Shekinah, which is often seen as the feminine aspect of God's presence, complementing the more traditionally masculine portrayals.
Wow. So the unifying idea there is that divinity and spiritual wholeness often involve this harmonious interplay of seemingly different qualities.
That's a really insightful connection. What about the second principle, lies as a stream of living water? What parallels does it find?
So in Christianity, you have Jesus offering living water that quenches spiritual thirst.
Right.
Islam speaks of the rivers of paradise that provide eternal refreshment.
Okay.
Hinduism venerates the sacred Ganges River as a source of purification and renewal. Buddhism often compares the teachings of the Dharma to water that nourishes all beings.
Okay.
And Judaism sees the Torah and prayer as sources of spiritual sustenance like living water.
So again, the common thread there is that recognition across these faiths of a divine source that provides spiritual nourishment and the idea that believers can become conduits of that life-giving energy to others.
Exactly.
Beautiful. Moving on to embrace the mystery of God's plan, what similarities does the chapter point out?
So in Christianity, there's the emphasis on trusting in God's wisdom even when it surpasses our understanding. Islam has the concept of tawakkul, which is placing one's trust in Allah's plan.
Hinduism teaches the importance of surrendering to the divine will amidst the uncertainties of life.
Got it.
Buddhism emphasizes embracing impermanence and letting go of the need for complete control.
Okay.
And Judaism has the concept of emunah, which signifies faith and trust in God's often mysterious ways.
So the unifying idea is that shared understanding that there is a higher wisdom at play that we may not fully comprehend, and that faith involves trusting in that wisdom.
Exactly.
I like that. What about lead by example? How does that resonate across these faiths?
So Christianity presents Jesus as the ultimate model for life and conduct.
Okay.
Islam views the Prophet Muhammad as the best example for Muslims to follow.
Got it.
Hinduism has the concept of dharma, which includes living according to one's moral and ethical duties exemplified by figures like Rama and Krishna.
Okay.
Buddhism presents the Buddha's life as the path to enlightenment, offering a living example. And Judaism emphasizes the idea of sanctifying God's name through righteous actions, with figures in the Torah serving as examples.
So the commonality is the importance placed on individuals embodying those values and principles of their faith, serving as a guide for others.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally, for practice humility and honor, what shared understandings does the chapter highlight?
Okay, so Christianity teaches that true greatness lies in serving others as exemplified by Jesus. Islam highly values humility as a virtue pleasing to Allah.
Got it.
Hinduism sees humility as essential for spiritual progress, recognizing the limitations of the ego. Buddhism teaches that overcoming pride is a crucial step on the path to enlightenment.
Okay.
And Judaism emphasizes the importance of humility before God and in interactions with others.
So the shared understanding is that true honor comes not from self-exaltation, but from a posture of humility and service to others.
Precisely.
It's pretty amazing to see these consistent themes emerge from, such diverse spiritual backgrounds.
It really is. And the chapter concludes this section with this powerful quote from St. Thomas Aquinas: "Truth cannot contradict truth," which I think really underscores this underlying belief in the harmony that can exist across these different paths when we look for those fundamental shared understandings.
So this response section takes that personal renewal fostered by the MAP framework and encourages us to extend that understanding outward, recognizing that so many of those core principles resonate deeply across these different spiritual traditions.
Exactly. It's about responding to our own spiritual growth with an open heart and mind.
I like that.
Recognizing that shared humanity and the shared pursuit of meaning and truth that connects us all.
This has been such an enlightening deep dive into this chapter. So as we kind of wrap up, what are some of the key takeaways you would want to leave our listener with?
I think the key takeaways are the powerful interconnectedness of simplicity balance, particularly that integration of strength and gentleness and humility as the bedrock of spiritual growth. The MAP framework offers a really practical and actionable way to cultivate this renewal in our lives through intentional shifts in our mindset, our aims, and our practices.
Yes.
And finally, the respond section illuminates this remarkable potential for finding common ground and fostering greater understanding among different spiritual traditions by recognizing these fundamental shared truths.
It really highlights that, becoming well-informed isn't just about absorbing information, but about recognizing those deeper connections that exist between seemingly different ideas and perspectives.
Exactly.
And we hope this deep dive has offered you, our listener, a valuable shortcut to understanding some of these complex and potentially life-enriching concepts without feeling overwhelmed.
Absolutely. And we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and, reflecting on how they might resonate in your own life.
Yes. So here's a final thought to consider. How might embracing simplicity in your own life create more space for deeper understanding and connection, both within yourself and with others who may hold different beliefs?